In the great wars that defined the American nation, the story of North Carolina is one of complexity and contradiction. They contributed Loyalists and Revolutionaries, Unionists and Confederates. The people who called this state home grappled with just who they were and where their loyalties resided. The result was hardship and loss, but also victory and rebirth. In 1770, much of North Carolina was still considered the frontier. Most of its 200,000 inhabitants lived on the windswept coasts. But like the inhabitants of the other 12 colonies, they lived under British rule, were subjects of the king, governed by a royal appointee and subjected to taxation. And like the residents in places such as Boston and Philadelphia, North Carolinians had grown weary of British rule and what they perceived as corrupt tax laws that exploited them to fund foreign wars. They formed their own protest movement, calling themselves Regulators. Years before the Revolution began, they had already engaged in hostilities with the militia formed by William Tryon, North Carolina's ruthless royal governor. The Regulators were defeated by Tryon's men near Great Alamance Creek. 7 captives were executed as an example, but Governor Tryon's suppression would not endure. By 1774, royal authority in North Carolina began to collapse. Patriot leaders establish a provincial Congress and take over most of the governance of the colony. On May 31st, 1775, Royal Governor Tryon's successor, Josiah Martin, flees the capital at New Bern. First, he shelters at Fort Johnston on the coast. Then, he seeks refuge aboard a British warship. From exile, he plots to restore British authority in the region. He hopes to mobilize support in the backcountry, where there is a large population of Scottish immigrants. He expects to raise up an army of loyalists that will link with the British regulars arriving by sea. Together, they will subdue the rebellious colonists. Wielding broadswords, dirks, and donning kilts, Martin's group of Scottish loyalists attempt an attack on a Patriot position north of Wilmington, but the loyalists are thrown back by a hail of gunfire. The Battle of Moores Creek Bridge ends in a Patriot victory. They gain control of the region as a result, and the supporters of the British Crown disperse, demoralized. North Carolina becomes the first colony to authorize its delegates in the Continental Congress to vote for American independence. Along the western frontier, the British encouraged their Native American allies to raid Patriot settlements in the upcountry. Beginning with assaults on Fort Watauga and Eaton Station, a series of raids are undertaken by the Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee tribes. But after a British defeat at Sullivan's Island in South Carolina, their support of the indigenous peoples evaporates. In the summer of 1776, North Carolina militia launch an invasion of Cherokee lands, destroying dozens of villages and forcing the Cherokee to give up large tracts of their homeland. Between 1776 and 1780, troops from North Carolina fight in the north and south. They fight side by side with South Carolinians at Sullivan's Island, and they fight under General George Washington's command at Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth. They endure the harsh winter at Valley Forge. In May of 1780, many North Carolinians helping to defend Charleston are captured after a 6-week siege when the British finally take the city. In anticipation of a British invasion, North Carolina Loyalists mobilize once more, but Patriot militias attack and rout the Loyalists at Ramsor's Mill in June and Colson's Mill in July. General Lord Charles Cornwallis initiates a 3-pronged approach from South Carolina and enters North Carolina, where he finds little enthusiasm for the British cause. Those who do sign up to fight for the crown are assigned to his western prong, commanded by Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson threatens and intimidates Patriot supporters. Enraged by Ferguson's actions, rugged patriots, the Over-Mountain men, rally to the Patriot cause, coming to blows with Loyalist forces on October 7, 1780. At Kings Mountain, the Patriots score a major victory. They succeed in surrounding Ferguson and his men, killing hundreds, including Ferguson. It is a turning point in the fortunes of North Carolina. That same month, Nathaniel Greene accepts command of the Southern Department. After the defeat at Kings Mountain, with his flank exposed, Cornwallis is forced to return to South Carolina. The Americans, under General Daniel Morgan, follow up with a double envelopment of British soldiers and gain a key victory at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781 over the reviled Banastre Tarleton. Cornwallis burns his baggage train to increase his column's speed and chases after General Nathaniel Greene's Patriot forces. Despite many close calls, Greene deftly avoids battle and crosses the rain-swollen Dan River in Virginia. Cornwallis and his army's exhaustion mingles with ongoing disillusionment. While Greene rebuilds the main American army in the South, North Carolina Loyalists suffer another defeat. On February 25, 1781, a group of Loyalist militia mistook American cavalry led by Light Horse Harry Lee for British dragoons. By the time they realize their error, it's too late. The Continentals rout the Loyalists in what comes to be known as Pyle's Massacre. In February of 1781, Greene leads the American army back into North Carolina. Cornwallis moves north with a force of now mostly British regulars. On March 15th, Greene and Cornwallis meet at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Greene establishes 3 lines of battle. Each line was better defended than the last. Greene's army inflicts terrible casualties on the British, who are slowed but not stopped in the largest Revolutionary War battle in North Carolina. The battle is a tactical victory for the British, who end the day in control of the battlefield. But more than a quarter of Cornwallis's soldiers are killed or wounded, men he cannot easily replace. He cannot risk his remaining men on further engagements, and decides to abandon the Carolina backcountry. Having had quite enough of the fruitless struggles in the Carolina backcountry, Cornwallis marches his exhausted army to Wilmington on the coast. From there, his army travels to Virginia, where he hopes to find more success and less frustration. But it is in Virginia, at Yorktown, that Cornwallis and his army will be surrounded and decisively defeated in October 1781 by George Washington and his French allies. Skirmishes in North Carolina between Patriot and Loyalist militias continue until the last British troops withdraw from the state in November of 1781. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris officially ends the war. In 1789, North Carolina becomes the 12th state to ratify the Constitution of the United States. Like other southern states, its economy becomes heavily focused on the cultivation of cotton and tobacco, and dependent on the labor of enslaved African Americans. By 1860, North Carolina's population has grown to 1 million people. Of these, 30% are held in bondage. As Civil War looms and the secession crisis sweeps across the Deep South in the winter of 1861, North Carolinians, especially in the Piedmont and western part of the state, oppose disunion. State political leaders rebuff calls for secession until the fighting at Fort Sumter, when Lincoln moves to suppress the rebellion in seceded states. North Carolina becomes one of the last states to join the Confederacy. Fighting comes quickly to North Carolina. Union naval and land forces target the state's northeastern coast along the Outer Banks. Their first objective, capture Hatteras Inlet. Long a safe and reliable passage between the Atlantic Ocean and the port towns along Pamlico and Albemarle Sound, the inlet gives Confederate blockade runners, fast ships that can evade Union blockading naval vessels, a lifeline to trade with Europe. The ports around the Sounds and the railroads that connect the coast to the interior of the Confederacy amplified the region's strategic importance. August 1861. A Union land and naval force arrives near Hatteras Inlet. Forts Clark and Hatteras fall. The victory encourages the North, strikes a blow at Confederate shipping, and positions the U.S. forces to further extend their control over the strategically important region. 1862. A second joint Army-Navy operation sets out to gain complete control over all the waters of northeastern North Carolina. General Ambrose Burnside and Flag Officer Lewis Goldsborough target Roanoke Island. By February 8th, they seize the island. The victory gives the Union control of both Albemarle and Pamlico Sounds, a foothold from which to launch further attacks. The port of Wilmington becomes ever more crucial to the Confederacy's supply lines. Burnside's men, supported by gunboats, march inland toward New Bern. A furious battle rages there on March 14th, in which Burnside's forces drive the Confederates away. Burnside's men capture New Bern, Havelock, Carolina City, Morehead City, and Beaufort. Fort Macon, guarding Beaufort Inlet, falls on April 25th. With U.S. naval forces in control of the North Carolina coast from the Virginia state line to the White Oak River, the Union holds a key strategic advantage. Beaufort becomes the primary coaling station for the Atlantic blockading fleet. New Bern becomes the military and political center for Unionists in the state. Union garrisons in the coastal towns threaten the vital railroad that connects the port at Wilmington to Richmond. Enslaved people flee inland plantations, seeking freedom at Union strongholds. Thousands of them will eventually join the United States Army. Union General John Foster launches a raid from New Bern to Goldsboro to burn the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad Bridge. Confederates resist the advance at Kinston and Whitehall. Raiders try, but fail to destroy the ironclad CSS Neuse. Foster's force reaches Goldsboro, clashes with rebels, and sets fire to the bridge. Foster retreats, declaring the raid a perfect success. The boast proves an overstatement, as Confederate troops repair the bridge within weeks. The Confederates are unwilling to allow the Union Army to continue to use New Bern as a base to threaten vital supply lines. In March 1863, a force of 13,000 men, commanded by General Daniel Harvey Hill, moves toward the Union base at New Bern. But after limited fighting and artillery exchanges that favor the Union, Hill calls off further operations and retreats. The following year, Confederates redouble their efforts to retake New Bern. In late January, Confederate General George Pickett leads 3 columns to approach the city from different directions. Union troops hold a strong line of fortifications, which Pickett realizes are too strong to attack. In April, General Robert Hoke again targets New Bern. Hoke's land force attacks Plymouth with the CSS Albemarle in support. Union forces surrender on April 20th. Hoke's column advances toward New Bern, and on May 4th and 5th captures Union picket positions along the banks of the Trent River, cutting the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad. But desperately needed naval support fails to arrive as the CSS Neuse runs aground near Kinston, and the CSS Albemarle is bested by Union gunboats in Albemarle Sound. Before he can reorganize his offensive, Hoke receives orders to return to the Army of Northern Virginia. The CSS Albemarle would be sunk later that fall in a daring commando raid led by Lieutenant William Cushing, brother of Medal of Honor recipient Alonzo Cushing. That fall, with Lee trapped in the trenches around Petersburg and Richmond, and with Mobile and Atlanta in Union hands, war planners in Washington focused their attention on capturing Wilmington. It's the Confederacy's last port at which supplies can be landed from England. And it hosts the last railroad network that connects the port and North Carolina's industrial facilities with Robert E. Lee's army. In December, Admiral David Dixon Porter and General Benjamin Butler launch a combined land and sea attack to subdue Fort Fisher and cut off the port of Wilmington, the Confederacy's last major port on the Atlantic coast. Sailors tow a gunpowder-laden ship, the USS Louisiana, near the fort and detonate it, causing little damage. Porter's gunboats begin a heavy artillery fire into the fort, while Butler lands his infantry force, skirmishing with Confederates who hold a strong defensive line between Fort Fisher and Wilmington. Though Union troops overwhelm the skirmish line, Butler fears that his rear is vulnerable and concludes that his force is too small to storm the fort. He calls off the attack and returns his troops to their transport boats. The Union fleet sails to Hampton Roads, leaving Fort Fisher in Confederate hands. A furious General-in-Chief Ulysses Grant fires Butler and replaces him with General Alfred Terry. Terry, with 10,000 men, and Porter, commanding a fleet of 58 warships, set out on a second land and sea operation. Porter's fleet begins an unrelenting bombardment on January 13, 1865. A landing force of sailors and Marines attack from the northeast, but suffer heavy casualties. The main infantry force attacks from the west and gains a foothold inside the fort. They advance steadily, and by nightfall, Union troops hold the fort. The fort's garrison flees to Battery Buchanan, but a force including United States colored troops pursues and captures the defeated rebels. Union forces move cautiously toward Wilmington. Fort Anderson on the Cape Fear River falls on February 18th, forcing Confederate troops to abandon their defensive position at Sugarloaf. Still hoping to defend Wilmington and prevent Terry's force from linking up with William T. Sherman's force, Hoke's troops established strong defensive positions at Town Creek and Forks Road. U.S. colored troops attacked the rebel position at Forks Road twice, but are repulsed. Despite their success, Hoke's Confederates received orders from Robert E. Lee and Braxton Bragg to retreat. On February 22nd, Hoke's men march away, leaving Wilmington defenseless. Union troops march into town with bands blaring later that day. Meanwhile, Union armies under General William T. Sherman advance into North Carolina. Disparate and heavily outnumbered, Confederate forces under Joseph E. Johnston look for opportunities to pounce on Sherman. After capturing Fayetteville, Sherman's two wings, under General Henry Slocum and General Oliver Howard, moved toward Raleigh and Goldsboro. Confederate General William J. Hardee deploys his troops across the Raleigh Road at Averysboro with orders to delay the advancing Union column so Johnston can consolidate his force. On March 16th, two Union corps launch multiple attacks, gaining ground all the while. Withering Confederate fire slows or breaks up each attack. Hardee retreats after dark and moves to join Johnston. The fight at Averysboro keeps the wings of Sherman's army separated long enough for the Confederates to concentrate. With his full force of 21,000 men, Johnston occupies a strong position at Bentonville. General Slocum's left wing presses forward on March 19th. He believes Johnston won't fight with his back to the river and presses forward without waiting for reinforcements. But Johnston does fight, and soon Slocum's wing is on the defensive. Confederates launch a grand charge that almost devastates Slocum's army. They succeed in some areas, but in others, they are deterred due to lack of coordination. Soon, reinforcements arrive and stabilize the Union line. Johnston's men are forced back to their original lines, where they dig in. Howard's right wing arrives on March 20th, extending their lines to Mill Creek. Johnston is heavily outnumbered and in danger of being flanked. Skirmishing crackles throughout the morning and early afternoon of March 21st. A Federal reconnaissance toward the Confederate left at Mill Creek Bridge becomes a major assault. The Federals come within a mile of the bridge, nearly cutting off the Confederates' path of retreat. But they are ordered back by General Sherman. In later years, he will criticize his order, deeming it a missed opportunity to end the campaign. With his one avenue of escape momentarily still open, Johnston abandons the battlefield and marches his force toward Smithfield, burning the Mill Creek Bridge behind him. At the same time, 6,000 cavalry troopers under General George Stoneman embark on a raid. They burn bridges, destroy railroads, and aim to reduce General Lee's hopes of escaping General Grant in Virginia. Stoneman nearly captures Confederate President Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet as they flee Richmond for safer points south. General Johnston recognizes that he can do no more than annoy Sherman. With the surrender of Lee's forces in Virginia, there is no hope of uniting his army with another substantial Confederate force. With scarce ammunition stores, limited food, and no hope of victory, he meets with General Sherman at Bennett Place to discuss surrender terms. Johnston surrenders his and other Confederate forces, totaling more than 89,000 men. It is the largest surrender of the Civil War. In the Civil War, more than 130,000 North Carolinians served in the Confederacy, with 8,000 in the United States Army, including 5,000 freed men of color. The Tar Heel state bears the high cost of the Civil War, with more than 40,000 North Carolinians dying in the war, 6% of its free population. From Alamance, Moores Creek Bridge, and Guilford Courthouse, to Fort Macon, New Bern, Fort Anderson, Bentonville, Bennett Place, and elsewhere, scores of conflicts were fought on this land to define a nation. That legacy continues as generations of fighters have trained here, from paratroopers who fought in France to today's U.S. Army Special Forces. The members of the American Battlefield Trust are proud to have preserved more than 2,500 acres of hallowed battlegrounds in North Carolina, so that current and future generations can stand where history happened, where they can reflect on the past and look ahead to the future.